UFC 328, Chimaev vs. Strickland is an upcoming mixed martial arts event produced by the Ultimate Fighting Championship that is scheduled to take place on May 9, 2026 at the Prudential Center in Newark, New Jersey, United States. The event will mark the promotion's 12th visit to Newark and first since UFC 316 in June 2025. A UFC middleweight championship bout between current undefeated champion Chimaev and former champion Sean Strickland is expected to headline the event. A UFC flyweight championship bout between champion Joshua Van and Tatsuro Taira is expected to take place at the event. The pairing was originally scheduled for UFC 327 in April, but 1 week before that event, Van withdrew due to a minor injury and the bout was shifted to this event. The matchup had previously been linked to UFC 302 in June 2024, before being moved to UFC on ESPN Perez vs. Taira 2 weeks later, where Taira faced a different opponent and Van's bout was ultimately cancelled. A UFC middleweight championship bout between current undefeated champion Chimaev and former champion Sean Strickland is expected to headline the event. A UFC flyweight championship bout between champion Joshua Van and Tatsuro Taira is expected to take place at the event. The pairing was originally scheduled for UFC 327 in April, but 1 week before that event, Van withdrew due to a minor injury and the bout was shifted to this event. The matchup had previously been linked to UFC 302 in June 2024, before being moved to UFC on ESPN Perez vs. Taira 2 weeks later, where Taira faced a different opponent and Van's bout was ultimately cancelled. A middleweight bout between former LFA middleweight champion Osman Diaz and Atiba Gauthier is expected to take place at this event. They were originally scheduled to face each other in October 2025 at UFC 320, but Diaz withdrew due to a medical issue. A welterweight bout between Sean Brady and Joaquin Buckley was originally slated to headline UFC Fight Night Sterling vs. Zalal 2 weeks prior, but it was moved to this card for undisclosed reasons. A featherweight bout between Daniel Santos and Choi Do-ho was expected to take place at the event. However, the matchup was moved to UFC Fight Night Allen vs. Costa, which is scheduled to occur 1 week later. The pairing had previously been scheduled for UFC Fight Night Ulberg vs. Reyes in September 2025, but Choi withdrew for unknown reasons and the bout was cancelled. Jim Miller and Jared Gordon are scheduled to compete in a lightweight bout at this event. They were once expected to meet at UFC on ESPN Cara France vs. Albazi in June 2023, but Gordon was pulled from the bout on the week of the event after not being medically cleared. A light heavyweight rematch between former KSW and UFC light heavyweight champion Jan Blachowicz and Bogdan Guskov was scheduled to take place at the event. However, Blachowicz withdrew due to a torn meniscus and the pairing was scrapped. The pair previously fought at UFC 323 in December 2025, where their bout ended in a majority draw after being moved from UFC Fight Night Sarukian vs. Hooker for undisclosed reasons. Fight card, Paramount Plus. Fight card, Paramount Plus. Weight class, method, round, time, notes. Middleweight, Chimaev vs. Strickland. Flyweight, Joshua Van vs. Tatsuro Taira. Heavyweight, Alexander Volkov vs. Waldo Cortez Acosta. Welterweight, Sean Brady vs. Joaquin Buckley. Lightweight, King Green vs. Jeremy Stevens. Preliminary card, Paramount Plus/CBS. Middleweight, Atiba Gauthier vs. Osman Diaz. Welterweight, Yoel Alvarez vs. Yaroslav Amosov. Lightweight, Grant Dawson vs. Mateusz Rebecki. Lightweight, Jim Miller vs. Jared Gordon. Early preliminary card, Paramount Plus/UFC Fight Pass. Middleweight, Roman Kopylov vs. Marco Tulio Blausulio. Featherweight, Pat Sabatini vs. William Gomez. Middleweight, Bisanger Susurkive vs. Jordan Santos. Flyweight, Clayton Carpenter vs. Jose Ochoa.